Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start in a few minutes. We still have some people joining, so if you'll bear with us for a minute or so. We look forward to giving you today's presentation on high fructose corn syrup. All right, I'm showing it as officially 3 minutes after 2, which was our starting time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's presentation entitled The Changing Ingredient Game, the Business Case for High Fructose Corn Syrup. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. During the presentation, you'll have the ability to send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. At the end of the presentation, we'll do a Q&A session to answer as many questions as we have time for. However, should a question occur to you mid-presentation, please feel free to submit and we'll answer it during the Q&A. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the ASB website's webinar page. Please note the ASB Archives page is restricted to member-only access. By default, I apologize, I seem to have skipped a slide. Anyway, let's just continue on. So now I'm pleased to begin today's event. Today's speakers will be Dr. John White, David Lockwood, and Martin Kincannon. Dr. White is president and founder of White Technical Research, an international consulting firm located in Argenta, Illinois, serving the food and beverage industry since 1994. He developed a specialization in nutritive sweeteners and is one of the foremost experts in high fructose corn syrup, the result of 31 years of research on the production, functionality, applications, consumption, and metabolism of this sweetener. Mr. Lockwood has been a research pioneer for more than 30 years. He has managed Mintel's growing U.S. and European research consulting since 2008, which directly supports the sales team in servicing Mintel's largest and most active clients. The consultancy team helps clients build brands, understand consumer trends, drive innovation, and develop strategy. Finally, Mr. Kincannon is the founder and managing director of Lafayette Associates. He has over 20 years of experience advising senior executives of leading multinationals in the areas of business strategy, corporate finance, performance measurement, incentive compensation, and process improvement. I wish to thank our speakers for joining us today and would now like to turn over the presentation into their capable hands. Martin, whenever you're ready, please feel free to begin.
Great, thank you. And I will just speak for a moment and turn this over to my colleague, John White. But really, thank you all for attending, and wanted to sort of talk about what brought us here. Our agenda for today is really to provide the most up-to-date facts on high fructose corn syrup and its role in the food chain, if you will, and particularly to focus on areas of particular interest to folks like you in the baking industry. And so we've done quite a bit of tailoring to focus our time there. And broadly, we'll talk about, as these questions lay out, what does the science say about HFCS? David Lockwood will talk about what consumers really think, and the reason he's able to do that, he's done quite a bit. He and his firm at Mintel have done quite a bit of original research talking to consumers very specifically about these issues. And then I'll talk about the final two areas, what happens from an economic standpoint when brands switch sweeteners. In this case, most of the time we're looking at sugar to HFCS, and in some cases from HFCS or from sugar back to HFCS. And then, what are some of the issues that we see from when you switch sweeteners from a brand perspective? So there's much to talk about, and with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Well, thank you very much, Marty. If I could have the next slide, please, and one more. Well, thanks and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak with you about the science of high fructose corn syrup and other nutritive or caloric sweeteners. We've got much more information to present on this topic than we have time to present today, so I'm going to just hit some of the highlights. Well, we're here today because of general confusion about high fructose corn syrup, and I think that's manifested in three ways, which you see on this slide. High fructose corn syrup has been mischaracterized, largely out of ignorance, and so there are some nutritionists and researchers that have erroneously suggested a direct and unique causation between the consumption of high fructose corn syrup and obesity. And we're going to talk about that very specifically today. The second area of confusion is that high fructose corn syrup is misunderstood. And this is due to improper influence of people who are really misinformed about the science and the health of high fructose corn syrup. So consumers have been told that sugar is a more natural substitute for high fructose corn syrup. And then currently, we're in the stage of misallocation of this product. Some companies have begun to replace high fructose corn syrup as an ingredient in their brands, largely for marketing purposes, and they're replacing it with sugar. Currently, there is no scientific evidence that there's any nutritional advantage in switching from high fructose corn syrup to sucrose or table sugar. This really is a misrepresentation to customers, and it warranties a false nutritional advantage where there is none. Next slide, please. I want to impress on you that there's general scientific agreement in two areas. The first area is that high fructose corn syrup and table sugar are safe. I'm hoping that you're advancing the next slide, please.
I have advanced the next slide. There seems to be a bit of a delay. Everyone, I do apologize about this.
Okay, so there's scientific agreement in two areas. One is that high fructose corn syrup and table sugar are safe, and this has been supported on two occasions. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has granted high fructose corn syrup GRAS status, generally recognized as safe, on two occasions. And so they've reviewed the entire science behind high fructose corn syrup, and largely because of its similarity then to table sugar or sucrose, they have stated that it is a safe ingredient. And the other area of general scientific agreement is that high fructose corn syrup and table sugar have no nutritive differences. And you see that there are several groups here, among many who support this statement: the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Medical Association, and an unlikely bedfellow, the Center for Science in the Public Interest. Next slide, please. Well, many of you have likely heard that high fructose corn syrup is somehow uniquely responsible for obesity, and I want to now discuss why that is not true. It's been an innocuous ingredient for 35 years now. It was a liquid sweetener alternative to dry sugar. It received GRAS status, as I said, on two occasions by FDA. Now, it is the major sweetener used in soft drinks in the United States, and there is some concern about overconsumption leading to obesity, and especially in children. So that has heightened the scrutiny on this ingredient. I think we can trace the attention focus specifically on high fructose corn syrup to a commentary published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2004 by Bray and Popkin. And in that, if you look on this slide from the left-hand side, 1990 to 2000, and if we went back in time, this would actually go back to 1970. There is a somewhat of a correlation between increasing high fructose corn syrup consumption, showed in red, and percent of obese adults, shown in the blue shading. So they showed this correlation then between 1970 and 2000, and from that they developed a hypothesis that high fructose corn syrup may be responsible for rising rates of obesity. Now, this came as a great surprise to those of us in the food industry and those of us who knew sweeteners pretty well. It came as a surprise because of the exclusion of sugar from this hypothesis. Sugar and high fructose corn syrup are very similar, and we've known this for a long time, in their composition, in their calories, in their sweetness, in their functionality, and in their consumption and in their metabolism. Those scientists know and understand that correlation is not causation. This proposal by Bray and Popkin was accepted by many health scientists and researchers and journalists and consumers, not as a hypothesis to be proven by further experimentation, but as fact. And from there, it really proliferated throughout the common culture. However, if we analyze the data between 2000, so that's about the middle of the slide, and the present, we see that high fructose corn syrup use peaked around 1999, and that has been in decline for 13 years, while obesity rates continue to rise. And I imagine this peaking and decline of high fructose corn syrup is a surprise to many of you listening. So there's been no correlation then between obesity and high fructose corn syrup for 13 years now. And the high fructose corn syrup hypothesis has been invalidated by recent data. Next slide, please. A far better explanation for obesity is the calorie imbalance between excessive intake of calories and insufficient exercise to use up the calories. You can download online macronutrient data from the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and you can graph it on a caloric basis like I did here. And looking at the bar graph at the left, you see that the calorie intake increased by 425 calories per day on average between 1970 and 2009. 425 calories. That's nearly an additional meal. If you believe that high fructose corn syrup is uniquely responsible for obesity, then you should be able to demonstrate that it contributed a disproportionate number of calories of this 425. And there is nutrient data available also from USDA for various classes of macronutrients, and added sugars is one of those. And you see from the pie chart then on the right, added sugars account for only about 9% of the increase. That's about 39 calories out of the 425. Where do the rest of the calories come from? Well, nearly 90% of them are accounted for by increases in fats and oils and cereals and grains. So I want to drive home the point that a myopic focus on high fructose corn syrup and added sugars in the obesity crisis is really misguided. Added sugars and high fructose corn syrup are a part of obesity, but they're really a minor part. And Americans are overweight or obese because we eat too much of everything. Next slide, please. Well, one myth about high fructose corn syrup is that it is absorbed differently than sugar. And in fact, once they're absorbed into the bloodstream, high fructose corn syrup is indistinguishable from sugar. So I show here on the left a structural comparison of common added sugars. On the top you see sucrose, And you see that that's comprised of the simple sugars glucose and fructose, but they're bonded together. So we call sucrose a disaccharide, the prefix di meaning two. High fructose corn syrup and fruit juice concentrate and honey are depicted at the bottom of the left-hand panel, and you see that those are also comprised of roughly equal amounts of glucose and fructose, but they are not bonded together. They're what we call monosaccharides, mono meaning one, or free sugars. Now, note that from whatever source, whether added sugars or fruits, vegetables, and nuts, which also contain about equal amounts of glucose and fructose, these all appear in the bloodstream as monosaccharide glucose and monosaccharide fructose. And why is this? Well, there's a bond in the lumen of the small intestine called sucrase, which breaks that bond in sucrose and liberates then free glucose and free fructose, and they are then transported into the bloodstream as glucose and fructose. The other ones, high fructose corn syrup, fruit juice concentrate, honey, are already monosaccharides, and these appear in the bloodstream then as monosaccharides. So your body can't tell the origin of the glucose or fructose in the bloodstream. Did it come from sucrose or high fructose corn syrup or fruits or vegetables? Your body cannot tell which they came from. Well, you would predict on a theoretical basis then that these sweeteners would be metabolized the same, and I'm going to show you some data in the next slide that is so. Another common myth is that our bodies don't know how to handle high fructose corn syrup and that we handle it differently than sugar. In fact, we can demonstrate the equivalence in metabolism between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose by their similar responses to metabolic measures of obesity. There have been several studies in the past few years that have demonstrated that the body handles high fructose corn syrup and sucrose the same. The one depicted in this slide is a study done by Melanson and co-workers in 2007, and this was published in the Journal of Nutrition. They recruited lean women to spend the night fasting in a metabolic ward. The next day, they fed them 3 meals. Each one was supplemented with a beverage that was sweetened either with high fructose corn syrup or sucrose. Blood was drawn every 30 minutes and analyzed for various metabolic measures of obesity. And this slide shows that plasma glucose on the right and insulin on the left are superimposable. That is, high fructose corn syrup and sucrose had identical effects on these two metabolic markers. Now, these researchers and others have shown that the same is true for the appetite hormones ghrelin and leptin, for triglycerides, and for uric acid. Next slide, please. So I want to emphasize to you that there is no scientific justification for reformulation. High fructose corn syrup and table sugar are nutritionally equivalent, and this is supported by numerous expert scientific panels shown in the left column, the most recent being this past April, and by the list of notable nutritionists in the right-hand column, including the originators of the high fructose corn syrup hypothesis, George Gray and Barry Popkin. Next slide, please. So the high fructose corn syrup issue scientifically has evolved into an added sugars conversation, as it properly should be. The most recent USDA food icon, shown on the left, features the proper portion size and nutrient ratios rather than advice about specific sugars. And industry labeling initiatives like that from GMA, the Grocery Manufacturers of America, feature information about 3 important areas of nutrition, 3 important nutrients, and also total calories. But again, no specifics about individual sugars. Next slide. So in my final slide, I'd like to give you the take-home message, and that is that medical and science experts agree there is no meaningful difference between high fructose corn syrup and sugar. Next slide, please. Well, we've reached the end of the science section, and I'd like to now turn you over to David Lockwood from Intel for a discussion of consumer perception. David?
Thank you very much, John. Yes, I'd like to get you started on some consumer research that Mintel has conducted on high fructose corn syrup, and also some research through Mintel's Global New Products database to let you know what manufacturers are currently doing with products that include high fructose or exclude high fructose corn syrup. So one of the key things on our consumer survey that we conducted was understanding that the way you get responses from people that relate to the way they actually behave. And the key there is that you need to ask questions in an unaided manner first to find out what is really important to consumers, and then you can follow up with aided questions. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. But really, the difference comes down to unaided responses are more predictive of future behavior, whereas aided responses tends to be the things that people say that they do that they don't actually follow up on. So what we see in the very next slide is the progression of the consumer questions that Mintel asked. First, we wanted to find out, do you read nutritional labels? And if you do, what are you reading them for? If you're reading labels, are you limiting or avoiding anything? And then moving away from labels, we wanted to find out if people had seen or heard any kinds of communication from the media about various sweeteners. And then we wanted to pull all that together and ask people, given all that you have seen or know about various sweeteners, how does this affect your purchasing behaviors? So in the next slide, we start off with the very beginning of the survey, which is, as I mentioned, do you read labels for nutritional information? And that's in the pie chart on the left. So as you'll see, about 3/4 of the respondents say that they either frequently or occasionally read nutritional labels. And this has stayed fairly stable for the last few years. So it's something that's easily replicated. And then what you'll find on the right in the bars is the second question. If you do read labels, what do you read those labels for? And what you'll find there is that consumers indeed know what they should be reading labels for. Just as John White showed on one of his graphs, they know that it's fats and oils and calories as the most important things. And then secondarily, also very high, is salt and added sugar. Those are the 4 things you should be reading labels for. A much, much smaller percentage over on the right, 3% of our respondents said that they specifically read labels for high fructose corn syrup. And we do capture the whole group of anything that involves HFCS. So whether they say HFCS or high fructose corn syrup or corn sugar or corn sweeteners, that goes into that bucket of HFCS, 3%. And also our survey was conducted by phone so that we were able to probe for responses. If you read labels and what do you read it for, we'd say, okay, anything else, and make sure that we get the whole list. So very thoroughly done. So on the next slide, we go one step further in, and you can see basically the responses we get to 4 different questions to which high fructose corn syrup could be a response, an unaided response. As I've already said, we ask, what do you read labels for? 3% say high fructose corn syrup. And then we ask next, if you're reading labels for things, are there any things that you or your family are trying to avoid on those labels? Again, 3% of people said that they were trying to avoid high fructose corn syrup. Then to cast the net a little bit wider, we asked if there was anything of any kind of messaging people had seen in the past 6 months on sweeteners of any type. It could be positive or it could be negative impressions, but we wanted to see how many people would name certain ingredients. And of that list, 9% of the respondents said that they had seen messaging regarding high fructose corn syrup. And then in the 4th question, we asked, just thinking about all sweeteners in general, which kinds can you name for us? And again, the phone survey probes for an additional one to make sure that you can think of everything. And there we capture 12% of respondents say that they know that high fructose corn syrup is a sweetener used in foods and beverages. And then the last bar, taking all that as a net, if you said yes to any one of those 4 questions, that amounted to 16% of respondents, what we say, have high fructose corn syrup top of mind. And again, even though 16% have it top of mind, only 3% said that they actually limit high fructose corn syrup. So, moving on, this takes us into some of Mintel's global new products database data, where we capture all of the new food and beverage products released. It's a global database, but this is accounting for only products in the United States. And roughly, we will capture about 20,000 new product launches every year. And what we find is roughly 400 of those are HFCS-free products. Just so you get a sense of how many HFCS-free products are on the shelf, it amounts to a shade over 2% of products. And it's gone up a little bit in the last couple of years, as you can see. And these, of course, are pretty new to the shelves. Not very many of them existed before 2006. So moving on, we look into these products a little bit further, and of interest to the baking industry is how many of the HFCS-free products are in various categories. Which categories do you find them in? And bakery is the leading category, but as you can see by number of new products, it's a very small number compared to the total number of products released in any of those categories. But the leading ones, as you can see, bakery, snacks, and dairy is where the no high fructose corn syrup claims are coming from. So then, move on to the next slide. We give you a look at the type of claims, health-related claims, that these products make. Or actually, this is back to the entire universe of products released in the U.S. A little more than a quarter will make kosher claims, and then all natural and no additive preservatives are the next leading claims. And down at the 2% level, as I said before, is no high fructose corn syrup. So as health-related claims goes, it's a relatively lightly used sort of a claim, and rates down with low or no lactose. Okay, so moving another step ahead. Again, particular of interest to the baking industry is we went back to consumers and asked them the question of, if you are buying packaged bread, is there any ingredients that you're looking for on the label? So we would ask them one by one for each of these ingredients. And so, in other words, do you consider vitamins when buying packaged bread? Do you consider calories when buying packaged bread? And the results show where some of the leading items shake out. And 36% of respondents say that they are looking for sugar when they're buying packaged bread. Then moving on to the next slide, we break that down a little further, and we say, here's the 36%. Those numbers all add up to 36%. If you're looking for sugars in packaged bread, why are you looking for sugar? What are you trying to accomplish? And as you can see, most of the people are just saying that they want to limit sugar or sweeteners in general, and that is indeed what we think is happening in consumer purchasing habits across the board, is that they're much more interested in, what is the sugar grams. They really don't care about any specific ingredients like high fructose corn syrup. They just care what are the total sugar grams. So out of those 36%, again, only 3% say that they're looking to avoid high fructose corn syrup. Mostly they're just looking to avoid sugars in general. That's one of the key points that I've got to make today, which is that consumers, again, know what they should be avoiding. It's the fats and oils and calories, and then further down the list, it's sodium and it's added sugars, but it's sugars in general. There are just a very small percentage of people who really know what high fructose corn syrup is or will pick out a product simply because it is HFCS free. So thank you very much for your time, and I will turn you over to Marty Concannon.
Thanks, David. We'll go ahead and skip to my next slide, and that's been very helpful, obviously, understanding where the science takes us and tells us that obviously there's no difference in HFCS and table sugar or other types of sugar. And from a consumer standpoint, it's something that's not particularly top of mind. We're going to talk really about what we can see from consumer purchase behavior, and we'll really rely on data to be able to tell us that. We'll look at quite a bit of Nielsen data in just a second. And just before we start, there's a couple other aspects of the story we wanted to touch on very briefly. And one of them is just, how much are people talking about this? And one common way, this is a relatively new slide we've developed, and it's helpful. It comes from Google. Obviously, everyone knows what Google are. And essentially, Google puts out an index about the most commonly searched words and terms. And we've used Google statistics to come up with a rating on high fructose corn syrup. And the footnote really indicates all the other derivations similar to what David was talking about. Corn syrup, corn sugar, all number of other potential aliases. And what it tells us is that, number one, that 1.4 index, if 1 would be the average prevalence of a Google search word, so we're a little bit more than average, but not a lot, and it's actually trending down considerably. Now, if we go all the way to the right on sugar, we see that people search Google roughly 40 times more often than they do high fructose corn syrup. That equates to some similar other statistics we see on traffic over the internet. Blog postings, for example, show similar relationships between HFCS and sugar. Interestingly, not only is it quite a bit larger, quantumly larger, in fact, it's in fact increasing. So people are talking more about sugar over the last 3 years, less about HFCS. Stevia, another natural sweetener, is increasing. Soda, of course, is increasing as well. We'll go to the next slide. So that gives us a sense of, why are people talking about HFCS? Well, they're talking about it, but not nearly as much as people might otherwise think. An important aspect of the traditional media that we'll talk about here very briefly, and I'll just essentially the two things. Really, the traditional media have the story right insofar as the science has always been settled and is irrefutably settled from their point of view, and it's happened several years ago. The New York Times, their quote is pretty poignant. It's an urban myth that high fructose corn syrup has a special toxicity, and that was in early 2009. Chicago Trib, my hometown paper. A danger, according to nutritionists, is that a label reading HFCS-free could become synonymous with healthy. And they're essentially pointing out this idea that because there really is no unhealthy aspect of HFCS relative to other sugars, that this is kind of it's creating some confusion or perpetuating confusion by labeling HFCS-free, and that in and of itself is a potentially controversial sort of trend. We'll turn ahead to look at what's really happening on shelves. And as a starting point, we look at Nielsen data that I think it used to be called AC Nielsen Company, who track performance of products and also track a number of issues relating to business performance. And one of them, they look at sales and other aspects of sales on grocery store shelves all around the country. We've asked them to look at a number of brands, 25 leading brands that have made a switch from HFCS to sugar, and in some cases they've begun to switch back, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. They represent over 3,000 SKUs, and they fall into 15 subsegments, and they're largely within food and beverage categories that we see here. Beverages, obviously, no surprise that we see HFCS in wide use in beverages. Baked goods is probably the next most important category, and the one that we'll focus on today, of course. And then prepared foods, things like condiments, for example, we'll talk about them. But when we go ahead, let's jump in. I will make one final caveat too, is that what are food and beverage marketing companies marketing, and this is something that David was touching on a moment ago, that only 2% of products say HFCS free. And again, we're looking at people switching formulations, so we know they go from HFCS formulations to HFCS free. They may or may not be talking about it. So we'll really look at companies that are brands that are switching, but may or may not be talking about it, because knowing that those that label the fact that they're switching sweeteners are relatively a small portion of the total. So looking ahead a couple of slides to my first graph, and this is, forgive me, this is one of our significant fresh bread brands. And what you're looking at, there'll be some similar trends here. Each of these vertical bars represents a 4-week period, so roughly a month of sales. On the left-hand side, we'll see sales that start in a gray bar, and that reflects when the product was sweetened with HFCS. And then we'll see the brown bars will represent when it was sweetened with sugar. So we'll see some period of time where a change in sweetener occurred. And then the black line at the top is a 26-week trending, which will help us to understand where the trend's going. And the simple fact is this is a fairly significant brand, but not a dominant one, of course, because they've got about 6% market share. And what we see is after the switch in sweetener in late 2006, there pretty much has been a sort of a fairly flat trend for the first couple of years, and then it's significantly moved downward. And that's, it's pretty clear that we can't see that there's any, I wouldn't suggest for a second that the change in sweetener had anything to do with the decline, but the important fact is it certainly hasn't helped this particular brand. And it's interesting in looking at these Nielsen charts for bread and bakery companies, bread particularly, is that they see they're fairly consistent from period to period. There's not much seasonality. We do see in this particular case a little bit of a spike that relates to promotion. Let's go to the next one. And we'll see another example of a fresh buns brand. This is another national brand, not quite as large, about 3.5% of share. And here we start to see a little bit more of the volatility that really relates not so much from seasonality as I think as much from promotional activity. But we notice we've got roughly a year's worth of HFCS performance, and then we see the sugar. And one of the things that I often see, not just when I'm looking in bakery, but we see brands that might be in decline. Suddenly, it's as if someone in a meeting said, you know what, maybe it's the HFCS is the problem. Maybe we need a sweetener change. That's really going to liven things up. And what we see is, consistently, it makes no difference. The trend we see beforehand really is the trend that we see after. Let's go to the next one. Of course, now we've looked at fresh bread and buns. We're looking at rolls here. And we see it, and this is a fairly small brand. This is only between 1% and 2%. Essentially, when we start on the left-hand side, this particular buns brand stays about 1%, and they drift down actually close to about 0.5%, and then they start using quite a bit of promotional activity to push their brand up to about 2%. Now, they must be pretty good at whatever promotional stuff they're doing because they've been able to double their share. Now, granted, when they're that small, you're able to do that. But it really illustrates the fact, and we notice the lag between switching sweeteners. It would be a tough case to make looking just at this limited data to say that the sweetener change really unlocked whatever potential they had to double the size of the brand over this period of time. It's relating to other things. We'll go ahead to the next one and look at English muffins. And this is a significant brand as well, about 5%. And similar story. There is more volatility here and promotional. And when you see, particularly as we know the English muffin brand has a very dominant player, which we'll look at in a moment, you would expect to see more volatility for a second or tertiary brand in a category like this. But here again, a similar story. A change in sweetener hasn't really done much for sales. They were roughly flat in the period after the switch, and they've since been in decline a couple of years later. Going to the next one, we see the dominant player, because obviously this isn't just, switching sweeteners wasn't something that was related to just a handful of brands. It's been, in some cases, a little bit widespread. Looking here at a leading English muffin brand, and I suspect we all know who the folks that carry about 40% of that category. Here again, we see relatively flat sales, a little bit of promotional spikes, but they've essentially replaced one sweetener with another, and their brand is performing pretty much the way it had prior. One thing you will note is that they did discontinue the front of package HFCS-free promotion. And that's something interesting. I can talk a little more knowledgeably in other categories that I've studied on a much more detailed level. But one of the questions we need to ask ourselves as food and beverage marketers is, for those brands, and there are few, relatively 2% overall, that talk about HFCS-free as if it were a benefit for consumers, if they don't recognize it to be a benefit, and science doesn't support that it would be, and the Chicago Tribune suggests it's kind of a bit of a confusing sort of tack to take, then what kind of marketing promotional benefit is being lost by using promotional bandwidth, with a message that doesn't resonate with people? And let's go to the next one. That's to me one of the leading takeaways to this. We've got a couple of other categories, and we've seen very similar stories. This is one of the major snack cracker brands, and this is within the cheese cracker category. And once again, we see a dominant player, 40% share. They've seen some promotional spikes to take it up over 50%, but in general, the 26-week trend stays pretty much flat. It's drifting down a share point or two. But we see quite a bit of period, almost 2 years worth of performance with HFCS. Going ahead to sugar, and we don't see much of a change at all. And finally, we'll look at one more snack cracker brand and see pretty much the same story. This is in the sandwich and snack pack category, the little sets of, like crackers with peanut butter and so forth in them. And similar, this is one of the more interesting ones. They actually do see the brand building about the time that they switched sweeteners. I'm inclined to think it's not necessarily related to that because it drifted downward shortly afterward. I mean, there's quite a bit of promotional activity happening there from the spikes would suggest, but this might be one that there might have been some minor benefit in the early period, but it's, at this point we're looking at almost 5 years of data, or 4 years of data certainly, and they're ending pretty much a little bit below where they started. So as we think of all this, inside the bakery category, if we're looking for a story where someone changed sweeteners, particularly moving from HFCS to sugar, it's hard to find. Let's go to the next one. It's hard to find a success story anywhere. Certainly brands are doing okay, some are falling off, but where we can look at a sales performance category and say it's coincided at all with a change in sweetener, we can't find an example like that. An interesting example outside of our bakery category is a familiar one to all of us, the log cabin syrup. And of course, this is a product that really supplants another natural sugar, maple sugar. It's essentially liquid sugar, the product, if you will. And it's very important, if you think of that it's using the number one ingredient on this particular package would be most likely sweetener, in this case HFCS in the early part, and switching to sugar. And I'll bring up we'll touch on this in a minute, because from an economic point of view, this is a particularly important ingredient. But for now, we're really just focusing on the marketing part. And what we can see here, again, roughly a 9% brand. Of course, we've heard of Log Cabin. It's a familiar one. And you see here it's a little different from looking at a bread category, because you see the promotion, both the promotional spikes, but more importantly, the seasonality for a product like this. But that's one of the ways that this trailing line really sorts out a lot of that volatility. But pretty clearly, they're a 9% brand when they start with using HFCS, and towards the end of it, they're still a 9% brand when they are sweetened with sugar. One last one of these that we'll look at is on the next slide. And this is another familiar category to us, Gatorade, who are a category. Obviously, they defined their category years ago. They still are the largest player by far with 35% share. They switched and promoted the switch away from HFCS to sugar a couple of years ago, coming up on 2 years ago. And so you see quite a bit of activity on the left-hand side in the gray, and then the brown activity reflects when they've switched to sugar. And it's a little difficult to see in the scale, but they've actually fallen off somewhat. And we've also, in this case, the black line is not the trailing trend, but in fact, that's Powerade, who are obviously a much smaller but an able competitor. Of course, Powerade is owned by Coca-Cola, and Gatorade's owned by Pepsi. And what that really tells us is even though they're sort of Gatorade, the dominant brand, they chose to switch sweeteners, make a big deal about it. They're one of those 2% that actually puts on the label that there's no HFCS in there, or they do certainly on the packaging, not necessarily the bottle label, but certainly on the packaging. They indicate that there's no HFCS in the product. Powerade obviously is a much more recent and newer brand and with a much smaller traction, but they are in fact gaining in share while Gatorade is giving it up. So if that's the idea that there's some sort of competitive advantage in your category, even for a dominant player like Gatorade, you're not seeing it on the performance at the store shelf. So moving ahead to the economic side of the story. So what we really looked at is we're looking all over to find a place where we can say, yeah, that marketing idea that someone had that HFCS is holding us back and we're going to switch to sugar and really going to see some pop in our sales line, you can't find an example where that hypothesis holds at all. And we've looked at quite a few of these. I've just pulled a few of them out, particularly the ones that we can find in the bakery category. One piece on economics, and I'll touch only briefly here. This comes from the folks at New England Consulting Group, who are experts in the food business as well, and they've taken a look at some of the costs associated with both sugar and HFCS, and they're suggesting that the cost of goods sold is somewhere in the 4 to 5 cent range, and that's going to equate to roughly 15 cents per loaf increase on the retail shelf. So a significant, as one reference point, a significant way to think of how the cost of using sugar as opposed to HFCS would play into the business. One other particularly important way, we'll go to the next slide, that I think really helps us to understand this trend of switching is if we think of looking back to the HFCS prices per dry weight. Of course, HFCS is delivered in a liquid weight, but to compare apples to apples, we use a dry weight price, and we're fortunate to be able to get price information from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They publish reference tables going all the way back to the early 90s, and for the period 94 to 2004, the difference in price from HFCS and sugar was roughly 10 cents a pound. I've highlighted the last 10 years or so, and what you see is it spiked up a little bit in the early or middle 2005 and 6, dropped down to nearly zero, or certainly averaging about 5 cents a pound. So relatively speaking, when brands were switching or contemplating a switch from HFCS to sugar and did so, they did so when the price difference was the smallest it had been in 20 years. And I reference that because now the difference in price between using sugar and HFCS is roughly 2 to 1. The last couple of years and still today, the price of sugar is pretty close to 50 cents, in the high 40s per pound. The price of using HFCS is in the mid to low 20s per pound. So we're roughly talking a 2 to 1 difference, going from maybe 5 cents a pound now to about 25 cents a pound. Next slide, please. And for example, a brand we'll talk about more closely in a moment, Capri Sun switched away in middle of 2008, which was a pretty popular time for brands to switch. Capri Sun, of course, is the brand owned by Kraft, or marketed by Kraft. It's a sweetened beverage for school kids. And not so much the $37 million to think about, but this is a brand that a couple $100 million in sales, and their cost difference was in excess of $1 million a month at the point that they made the switch. And this graphic, and we'll move off of it in a moment, but you'll see it shows in the early period of having switched, the price differences was small, but over time it grew enormously. Go ahead to the next one. And so ultimately, the question we want to ask is for those brands that have switched, can you switch back? Well, the answer is kind of easy. Well, yes, we know they have because we've seen brands doing it. But there are two main ways we'll really want to talk about that. The first one is changing the formula. Those who have changed the formula, can you change the formula all the way back? And we'll go to the next slide. And Capri Sun is the example we use. And, of course, we're familiar at looking at these charts. And one of the things that's a little different about the Capri Sun example here is that their business actually moved from about 10% in share on the left when they started. They switched to sugar and actually increased the business to about 12%. And I can speak with great affinity because I've studied this with a couple of academics, that they launched a very successful ad campaign, and they did a number of other things to build the business, and were able to maintain it even after they elected, and you see on the right, even after they elected to switch back from sugar to HFCS. Now, if one looked at this picture and said, well, wait a minute, was the change in sweetener what was driving the increase in their business? Well, they don't think it was, and as I said, there are a number of reasons that they changed on the promotional side that suggest it didn't, but it's particularly instructive to see that they did not see any drop-off having switched back from sugar to HFCS a little over a year ago. And when we go to the next page, what can be learned? One of the things that you'll find, and I would encourage anyone with an interest to go to the Capri Sun webpage, because they talk very openly and expertly with their consumers. Why did we make a switch back to HFCS? For those consumers that would have been curious, and they just talk, very plainly about the fact that it provides the safety and the taste that they're looking for and that their parents demand, but at the same time it helps them to manage, the cost of ingredients, which are significant. Because even this is a highly competitive market, and ultimately the little juice boxes sell for 20 or 22 cents a box, and the change in sweetener cost was almost a penny a box. So it was a very profound difference when they changed back. So one example is what Capri Sun did, which is they switched their entire brand. They realized it was not working, it was not providing any benefit, it was significantly damaging their bottom line. They switched all the way back. Now we go to the next example. If we switch ahead to the Heinz ketchup example, here's a quick graphic, and again, I'll encourage people, go forward please. I'll encourage people to look at the Capri Sun website, because it's a really good example of how to talk to consumers about issues like sweetener choice. Heinz was very interesting. Of course, they're a dominant brand, 60% share in the ketchup category, and obviously a very well-regarded brand for many reasons. They were curious about sweetener choice, and was there some advantage to having an HFCS-free offering? It was interesting that they chose to do it in an unusual way, whereas they have they switched sweetener type from HFCS, which is what you will find in the basic Heinz ketchup offering always for quite some time and today still, but they did offer an HFCS-free version sweetened with sugar, but also lower in sodium and in a smaller bottle with a premium price. So they sort of floated that idea, and they did pretty well with it. It accounts for about 6-7% of consumer from the market category. But the question one has to ask is, if you look at the top line, they started out 60% and they're still there. So they really migrated some of their existing customers into a different offering. Are they really farther down the road? Well, you might be able to argue that in a little way they're probably better off insofar as they've migrated people, the consumers, from their regular price product to a premium price product, but recognizing that it comes with premium cost. Go ahead to the next slide. We'll see their competitor, of course, and distant competitor is Hunt's. They're about 1/4 the market share that Heinz had. And they had this idea that, kind of to use that poker terminology, they would double down. So if they offered a line extension, well, we'll just go in and offer the whole thing. And it's been a catastrophe. In fact, on the top you see overall consumer demand for HFCS-free ketchup was not as strong as expected, and that was just over a month ago. And they've since switched back. So this picture will look much different, but what you see is they doubled their sweetener cost and got absolutely nothing for it in the consumer's eyes. One interesting thing about switching back is they've decided they will actually apparently leave a HFCS-free line extension option, similar to what Heinz had done all along. So from a business standpoint, those folks seem to really have the right idea of how to go about doing this. I'll skip ahead to a couple of pages and ultimately think about what we come away from, when we sort all this through. And we'll go ahead and stop it here from Hunt's. We focus on what Hunt's folks said in the top of the page here. Overall, consumer demand for HFCS-free ketchup was not as strong as expected. Now, as it turns out, they're the only one that was so bold and blunt about saying, you know what, we had high hopes for the HFCS-free strategy. It was really going to be something that consumers really gravitated towards. It was really going to help us to build our brand. It didn't come true. It didn't happen. And that's consistent with what we would expect if the folks at Mintel do their job right, as I'm very confident they do, that when unaided, and David laid it out, unaided really best predicts what customers and consumers are going to do. Aided research will definitely give you a much more inflated, it's what they say they're going to do, not what they actually do. So it's strongly suggestive that the unaided answers tell us roughly 3, 4, 5% of the folks are out there are interested in HFCS-free. Heinz experience suggests that that's about what you'll find if you do it the right way. Everybody else who decided to switch their entire brand really were disappointed because there was no, if you look at the entire population segment, as many of these brands do, most people just aren't at all worried about it. They're just not looking for it. They're not reading labels for it. They're not concerned about it. And from a business standpoint, particularly over the last couple of years, the difference is profound from an economic point of view. So as we move ahead to sum away, shoppers, the data analysis from looking at over 3,000 SKUs, over a number of brands in food and beverage, and focusing today pretty deeply on the bakery category, it really just shows that HFCS-free doesn't deliver increased sales, share, or profits. And we've got quite a bit of time left for questions, and I hope we get a chance to cover those. I will turn it back to Amanda if I just stop on one next slide, please. And I'll just mention one thing. Oftentimes we will, summarizing again, all sugar is the same. The consumers aren't really focused on HFCS-free as a message, and when we look at what's happened on the shelves, it reinforces the fact that people are just not paying much attention to HFCS-free. And then the next slide, please. For those of you who might have a question, there was a little bit of news from the Food and Drug Administration, and they made a ruling on the potential use of other alternate names for HFCS. And so you see a press release from the folks at the Corn Refiners Association. And for those of you who like more information about that, you'll find that at cornnaturally.com. And one final thought before we turn it over for questions. If there's anyone, for those of you listening, representing your organizations, if there's an aspect of the story that resonates with yourself and it's something that would be interesting to other people within your organizations, marketing, R&D, procurement, wherever, we're very happy to talk about putting together a presentation for your organization. And please just reach out to us here at this number or at cornnaturally.com, and we'll set it up right away. So with that, I'm back to Amanda, and let's have some questions.
All right. Thank you to John, David, and Marty. So we're going to go ahead now and open up the Q&A session. I know we're coming up on our 1 hour mark, but we can always take some questions if you want. And if we do go over any questions that you submit, I'm sure the presenters will be happy to answer off air, and we can put together a Q&A sheet with those asked questions. So as a quick reminder, to submit a question, please make sure your attendee panel is open by clicking the orange arrow. Enter your question into the question box and click send. When received, we will read the question aloud to the presenters and they will answer. So we're going to wait a couple minutes and see if anyone has a question. In the meantime, I just want to remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the ASB webinar archives page, that this is a member-only site for access, but we also encourage you to consider joining ASB, in which case you'll have access to all our past webinars, including this one and other great resources. You can get more information by accessing the ASB website at www.asbe.org. Still going to wait a few more seconds to see if anybody has any questions. In the meantime, I'm going to bring up the next slide. So if you have, there will be a follow-up email and survey, and if you have any questions regarding this webinar or ASB in general, please feel free to contact me, Amanda Gonzalez. I'm the membership manager, and my phone number is 1-800-713-0100. 0462, extension 3, and my email is agonzalez@asbe.org. All right, it doesn't seem that there are any questions coming in, and since we are at the 1-hour mark, I am going to go ahead and conclude the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you to Martin, John, and David again for a very informative presentation.